The silence was louder than any scream could ever be. For 6 years, the world had watched a war unfold in real time. A war fought not with swords or armies, but with interviews, tell-all books, and carefully timed headlines. From the sun-drenched terraces of Montecito to the ancient corridors of Buckingham Palace, it was a battle that captivated millions. Meghan Markle, armed with cameras, publicists, and the language of modern victimhood, launched attack after attack. The palace, slow and silent, absorbed every blow without flinching. And then, without warning, everything stopped. No new podcast, no explosive social media post, no memoir teaser threatening to topple the monarchy. The Duchess of Sussex, whose name had dominated every news cycle for half a decade, simply vanished. Not with drama, not with explanation, just gone, across the Atlantic, in a private office tucked deep within St. James's Palace. The reason for that silence sat quietly on a rosewood desk. It wasn't a press release, it wasn't a royal decree, it was a dossier, unmarked, confidential, and devastating. And it was in the hands of Princess Anne, the one member of the royal family no one dared to cross. What began as an investigation had become something far more dangerous. A verdict. Royal watchers had spent years asking what Meghan would say next. But now, a new question whispered through the halls of power, chilling in its quiet intensity. What had Anne discovered? Behind the golden gates and centuries-old traditions, Princess Anne had emerged as the monarchy's silent enforcer. While others scrambled to issue statements or manage optics, Anne did something far more calculated. She read timelines, she studied patterns, she followed the money, not out of curiosity, out of duty. And when duty moves with precision, it becomes a force more terrifying than any scandal. The palace's silence, mistaken by many as weakness or confusion, was neither. It was a trap, a meticulously designed snare that had been tightening for years. While Montecito raged and threatened, St. James's prepared for something far more surgical, a controlled demolition. The spark came during Meghan's final media appearance before the blackout. She spoke with an edge, hinting at documents that would cause international outrage if released. She wasn't bluffing. She spoke with the certainty of someone who believed they held the detonator to an empire. In London, that threat didn't trigger panic. It triggered protocol. The investigation had already been quietly underway for months, moving through layers of palace bureaucracy like water through stone. But this moment shifted everything. What had been passive observation became active containment. Inside the palace, a command team reporting directly to Princess Anne began their work. They called it the Onyx Protocol. Those who understood its purpose called it something else. DEFCON 2 for the British Crown. It started with what wasn't there. Missing travel logs from late 2017, security checks that had been bypassed without explanation, unaccounted meetings in cities that should have triggered diplomatic notifications. At first, these gaps seemed like clerical oversights, the kind of administrative chaos that happens in any large institution. But when the forensic team began connecting the dots, those oversights revealed themselves as something far more deliberate. Names of American public relations firms appeared in palace records months before the engagement was even announced. Payment trails that had been dismissed as routine celebrity earnings suddenly aligned with coordinated media activity. Stories that seemed spontaneous were anything but. There were drafts, there were plans, there were contracts. This wasn't a fairy tale gone wrong, this was an operation, and it had been running long before anyone realized. Princess Anne, upon reading the third executive summary from her team, didn't raise her voice. She didn't slam her hand on the table. She simply marked a single passage with her pen and said 4 words that would change everything. Prepare the enclosure. It was a phrase her inner circle understood immediately. Not a public scandal, not a media war. An institutional response. Quiet, methodical, and irreversible. The royal family would not fight with words. They would strangle the operation in silence. And so began the erasure. Invisible protections that had been quietly extended to the Sussexes were withdrawn. Travel courtesies vanished. Informal security advisories stopped flowing. Access to private diplomatic briefings, the kind that smooth international travel and open doors at embassies, was severed without announcement. Commercial partners who had aligned themselves with the Sussex brand began sensing a seismic shift. One by one, they withdrew. Long-standing media allies stopped returning calls. Even the gossip columns of Los Angeles, always hungry for royal drama, went eerily silent. In Montecito, the change was immediate and suffocating. Meghan, who had spent years standing by her floor-to-ceiling windows rehearsing her next statement of defiance, found herself trapped in a void. There was no attack to counter, no insult to weaponize, just silence, cold, unblinking, absolute. Inside Kensington Palace, Princess Anne signed the final document that palace insiders would only refer to as the Notice of Intent. It was never made public. It didn't need to be. According to sources close to the operation, its content was short and devastatingly clear. A conditional threat to release the 2018 bullying report in full, the pre-engagement financial audits that had been quietly buried, and the travel logs that had now been cross-referenced with undisclosed meetings involving image consultants and media strategists. The message was unmistakable. Continue the war and the truth will no longer remain redacted. This wasn't a press strategy. This was Cold War diplomacy. But unlike Montecito's approach of volume and spectacle, Princess Anne had chosen a weapon far more lethal. Silence calibrated with absolute precision, and it worked. And, while the world continued debating tabloid headlines and parsing royal body language, Princess Anne's team was dissecting a different story entirely. One written not in newspaper ink, but in metadata, financial records, and deleted emails. Their investigation had shifted focus to a time most people had dismissed as romantic history. The year 2017. Before the wedding dress, before the balcony kiss, before Meghan Markle became the Duchess of Sussex, on the surface, it had been a time of celebration. A prince finding love, an American actress stepping into a fairy tale. But buried beneath the glittering surface were discrepancies that now read like alarm bells no one had been allowed to hear. Analysts working under Anne's direct orders discovered that certain standard procedures had been quietly abbreviated. Background checks that should have taken months were fast-tracked. Security clearance protocols, normally airtight within the royal household, had been bypassed. The justification at the time? Concerns about appearing discriminatory. Multiple aides, now retired or quietly reassigned, admitted in sealed memos that they had been pressured to ignore red flags. The priority had been harmony, not due diligence. The deeper the investigation went, the more troubling the picture became. There were gaps in Meghan's travel history that didn't align with official records. Discrepancies in customs declarations. A series of unlogged meetings with individuals who were later identified as connected to public relations firms, branding consultants, and media handlers based in the United States. These weren't casual coffee meetings. These were structured, strategic sessions involving corporate image specialists, and they were happening months before the palace was even informed of a formal engagement. Then came the discovery that changed everything: financial flows. Small payments, carefully structured to avoid triggering audits. Anonymous donors routed through limited liability companies. Cross-border wire transfers that formed a pattern impossible to ignore. When the forensic accountants finally assembled the puzzle, the picture was chilling. Meghan Markle's entry into the royal family hadn't been organic. It had been commercially premeditated. The team uncovered contract drafts from media production companies dated late 2017. Proposals for documentary series concepts centered on a young American outsider navigating the British monarchy. These weren't opportunistic pitches created after the fallout. These were being brainstormed before the wedding invitations were even printed. Princess Anne's reaction, according to one senior aide, was the only time anyone had seen her visibly shaken. She wasn't just angry, she was devastated. The documents showed that media access had been traded behind palace walls in exchange for favorable coverage. That intimate family moments had been cataloged not as memories, but as content. The implication was staggering. Meghan hadn't entered the royal family to join it. She had entered to document it, to build a franchise. That realization reframed everything that came after. The Oprah interview, once seen as a desperate cry for help, now looked like a scheduled climax in a long-running script. The Netflix deal wasn't an organic opportunity born from exile. It was a pre-existing relationship waiting for the right moment to activate. The complaints about racism and institutional cruelty, real or perceived, had served a dual purpose. They were both shield and sword, protecting against scrutiny while building a billion-dollar brand. Princess Anne wasn't simply upset. She was activated. The evidence confirmed what she had suspected but never voiced. The institution hadn't been attacked by an outsider. It had been infiltrated by a strategist. And now, with the full picture in view, she moved to the next phase. She began issuing confidential orders to constitutional lawyers, requesting an expedited review of the letters patent of 1917, the legislative foundation that governs royal titles and privileges. The question she posed was no longer theoretical. It was legal. Could the Crown prove that its internal mechanisms had been exploited under false pretenses? And if so, what remedies existed under constitutional law? Meanwhile, 3,000 miles away, the atmosphere inside the Montecito estate began to shift. Sources close to the household described a palpable change in energy. Meghan, usually assertive and composed, was now on edge. She made frantic calls to advisors. She began deleting correspondence. She reviewed old contracts with a desperation that her team hadn't seen before. Harry, less involved in the logistical side, became consumed by what he perceived as a coordinated conspiracy of silence from his family. But the silence wasn't a conspiracy, it was coordination. The palace had made a choice: containment over confrontation, legal groundwork over public retaliation. They weren't preparing to strike, they were preparing to sever. And they knew the moment to act wouldn't come when the Sussexes roared again. It would come when they went completely, unbearably quiet. The investigation had revealed a truth that no one in the royal family wanted to face. The fairy tale hadn't unraveled due to cultural misunderstandings or media cruelty. It had been constructed to unravel. Each conflict, each leak, each carefully timed revelation had served a dual purpose: weaken the institution, strengthen the brand. It was influence laundering at its most sophisticated. As Princess Anne reviewed the final intelligence summary, she posed a single question to the room. If this had been any other organization, if a CEO had discovered this level of exploitation within their own boardroom, what would they have done? The answer came immediately: terminate the contract, freeze the accounts, seal the exits. Anne didn't nod. She simply reached for her pen. What happened next didn't arrive as an explosion, it arrived as suffocation. In Montecito, what had started as a brief pause in media activity turned rapidly into something far more alarming. Phone calls weren't returned, publicists went dark. PR agencies that had once competed for the privilege of managing Meghan's image began issuing polite but firm disengagements. Sponsorship discussions stalled without explanation. And most unsettling of all, the financial back channels, those carefully obscured pathways through brand partnerships and charitable pass-throughs, began to wither. It wasn't a scandal that silenced Meghan Markle. It was gravity. Across the ocean, Princess Anne's operation had entered its second phase, a strategic throttling designed not to punish publicly, but to isolate systematically. London wasn't waiting for Meghan to speak, it was waiting for her to realize she was no longer being heard. The Duchess, who had once commanded headlines with a single raised eyebrow, suddenly found her words bouncing into an echo chamber. Major media platforms that had featured her prominently began delaying projects. Interview slots were deferred indefinitely. Keynote speeches were quietly postponed, and the invitations that had once poured in from high-profile events across 2 continents simply stopped coming. Internally, Anne's team had identified what they called vulnerability nodes across the Sussex media network. Strategic choke points where a single discrete pause in support would trigger a cascade effect. And one by one, those nodes were activated. Editors who had championed Meghan's narrative grew hesitant. A-list celebrities who had publicly aligned themselves with the Sussexes began citing scheduling conflicts. Netflix, already under pressure from investors questioning the return on their Sussex investment, started quietly reconsidering the entire content pipeline. This shift accelerated after a redacted intelligence dossier landed on a senior executive's desk, outlining previously undisclosed conflicts between Meghan's documentary projects and classified royal timelines. The message embedded in that dossier was crystal clear. There would be no further immunity for narratives rooted in distortion. Inside the California estate, the change in atmosphere was almost physical. The usual rhythm of activity, brand strategy calls, video production planning, political networking, ground to a crawl. What had felt like the birth of an empire now felt like machinery unplugged from its power source. Those close to the household described Meghan's state as somewhere between anxious and defiant. She clung to the belief that London's silence was temporary, that the palace was merely regrouping before launching a counterattack that she could then weaponize. Her solution was escalation. New scripts were drafted for interviews that would never air. A second memoir outline began circulating among literary agents who were suddenly difficult to reach. The strategy was to provoke a response, to drag the monarchy back into a reactive stance where the Sussexes could control the narrative framing. But Princess Anne had already anticipated this move. Back in London, every potential escalation was being tracked before it was executed. Meghan's trademark filings, her production company registrations, even the travel bookings made by her personal stylist. Anne's team wasn't surveilling in the traditional sense. They were conducting administrative surveillance. Meghan had spent 6 years playing a game of optics and perception. Anne had chosen to play a game of infrastructure. And quietly, methodically, the scaffolding holding Meghan's public persona began to collapse. But it wasn't just professional isolation that unraveled the Sussex narrative. It was something far more personal. Harry. For 6 years, he had been her unshakable shield. The loyal husband, haunted by his mother's ghost, determined to rewrite the tragedy of 1997 by protecting his wife from the same forces he believed had destroyed Diana. But now, in this suffocating silence, a different story was beginning to emerge. One not shouted from rooftops, but whispered in closed-door meetings and encrypted communications. Somewhere in London, a parcel had been prepared. Unmarked, securely sealed, and hand-delivered through diplomatic channels to an address in California known only to senior intelligence operatives. Inside were documents, transcripts of internal palace meetings, emails with metadata intact, unreleased summaries from the 2018 staff investigation, all heavily redacted, but the message embedded within them was unmistakable. We know. And now, so do you. Harry read them alone, in silence. There was no shouting, no dramatic confrontation, but something fundamental shifted in the way he moved through their home. The man who had once seen Meghan as his savior, the woman who understood his pain and validated his anger, began to see shadows in places there had only been light. He started double-checking dates, revisiting memories, noticing for the first time that certain private conversations he remembered having had been recorded without his knowledge. The cracks in trust didn't announce themselves with thunder. They appeared in glances, in pauses, in moments of silence that stretched too long. Friends close to the couple noted that while Harry's public loyalty remained intact, something in his private demeanor had changed. He spent hours alone in the garden, staring at the ocean without speaking. He declined meetings, citing exhaustion that seemed deeper than physical. And most tellingly, he stopped insisting with absolute certainty that they were doing the right thing. Meghan noticed. Her frustration turned inward, then outward. She pushed for a new interview strategy, one that would reframe the silence as persecution. She urged their legal team to consider surprise litigation in UK courts, anything to break the spell of irrelevance that was settling over them like fog. But the silence wasn't coming from the palace anymore. It was coming from within their own home. Princess Anne's strategy had crossed a threshold. It was no longer political. It was psychological. This was classic Cold War containment theory applied to modern media warfare. Create a reality so devoid of friction, so absent of narrative fuel, that your opponent begins to consume themselves from within. Back in London, final preparations were accelerating. Legal advisors drafted legislation under the guise of modernization efforts. Parliament had not yet been formally briefed, but preliminary conversations were already unfolding in select committees. Titles, inheritance rights, and Counselor of State privileges were all under constitutional review. Princess Anne wasn't preparing to strike publicly, she was preparing to sever permanently. And she understood that the moment to act would come not when the Sussexes roared back into the spotlight, but when they went completely, irreversibly silent. The monarchy had survived wars, abdications, scandals, and assassination attempts, but this was different. This was the quiet elimination of a threat through the removal of attention itself. Meghan had built her power on narrative oxygen, on the constant flow of media coverage and public fascination. Princess Anne had turned off the air supply. The seeds of what would become the final reckoning had not been planted in scandal or tabloid fury. They had been planted in a quiet conversation held in the drawing room of Balmoral Castle during the summer of 2022. It was one of Queen Elizabeth II's final private audiences, and only 2 people were present, Her Majesty and her only daughter. What was said during that hour has never been fully disclosed, but senior courtiers confirm it was the moment the late Queen entrusted Princess Anne with a burden she could no longer carry herself. The monarch, frail but entirely lucid, reportedly gestured toward a sealed folder resting on her writing desk. "If it comes to it," she said quietly, "use this to protect the crown, not us." That folder, later referred to by aides as the sovereign's envelope, contained preliminary findings from the palace's internal risk assessment on the Sussexes. Not just the widely reported bullying complaints or staff resignations, these were deeper concerns. Patterns of influence that didn't align with protocol. Inconsistencies in Meghan's financial disclosures during the engagement period. Gaps in security vetting that had been diplomatically smoothed over at the time, but flagged repeatedly by intelligence advisors. The Queen had seen enough to understand that the crisis facing the monarchy was no longer personal. It was existential, and she trusted only one person to act without hesitation, without sentiment, and without fear. Anne. Even then, there had been resistance within the family. Charles, newly titled as Prince of Wales, favored patience and quiet reconciliation. William wanted to focus on public duty and avoid deepening the family fracture. Even the Queen herself had been reluctant to escalate during her final months, but the toll was visible to those closest to her. Aides recalled how Her Majesty's expression would subtly change whenever Sussex-related briefings reached her desk. One courtier described it as the only time the Queen's composure seemed to falter, not with anger, but with weariness. She did not want to see her family at war. But she also understood that inaction was allowing the institution to be devoured from within. That burden, that final directive, now fueled Princess Anne's relentlessness. In the months following the Queen's passing, Anne quietly assembled what insiders would call a shadow task force. Constitutional historians, privacy law specialists, and intelligence veterans who had spent decades protecting state secrets. Their mandate was narrow and chilling. Prepare for the complete legal separation of the Duke and Duchess of Sussex, but do it in a way that preserves institutional credibility, national dignity, and Commonwealth unity. The internal code name for the initiative was Crownstone. At its core was a single operational principle: no engagement, only extraction. And Anne had one critical ally in this effort, Princess Catherine. While Catherine's public image remained serene and graceful, her schedule filled with school visits, garden openings, and international goodwill tours, behind palace walls she played a subtle but pivotal role. She was the human contrast to the chaos emanating from Montecito, unshakably kind, emotionally present, quietly loyal. Every time Meghan launched a new headline, Catherine countered not with words, but with visibility, with grace, with duty. It was this contrast that Anne used strategically. Insiders say Anne personally coordinated a sequence of meticulously calibrated public appearances for Catherine throughout the final quarter of 2025, not for damage control, for legacy anchoring. From Catherine's keynote speech at the UN Peace and Protection Summit to her patronage announcement for child bereavement services, each event was designed to tether the crown to a deeper narrative: service over spectacle, duty over drama. Meanwhile, as the Sussexes drifted further from institutional favor and media relevance, their influence began to erode in real time. Meghan's team proposed increasingly dramatic strategies: a solo documentary series, a political listening tour across swing states, a partnership with a major tech platform to launch a wellness empire. But every move collided with the same immovable obstacle. No one at the top was responding. The palace's silence had transformed from a defensive posture into a psychological siege. And this was Anne's strategic genius. She understood that noise requires opposition to sustain itself. Remove the friction, and even the most explosive statements begin to float weightless, ignored, irrelevant. But behind that calculated silence, Crownstone had moved into its final operational phase: parliamentary clearance. A draft memorandum had been prepared and quietly circulated among trusted members of key House of Commons committees. It outlined, in precise legal language, the constitutional justifications for removing Prince Harry from the line of succession and stripping all remaining institutional privileges. There was no mention of personal scandal, no public insult, just cold administrative logic, irreconcilable breach of institutional trust. Princess Anne had waited 3 years to act on the contents of her mother's envelope. Now, with the monarchy standing at a crossroads between tradition and survival, she was prepared to use it, not as a weapon of revenge, but as a scalpel of necessity. The moment that shifted everything didn't unfold in a televised hearing or a palace press conference. It happened in a private letter, unsigned, hand-delivered by a senior royal courier to Clarence House. The sender was Prince Edward. Until that moment, Edward had been the quiet stabilizer, loyal, discreet, always deferring to protocol and family harmony over public confrontation. But in the days following the internal circulation of the Crownstone Memorandum, he did something no one had anticipated. He formally withdrew his support for the Sussexes' constitutional relevance. The letter was brief, just 3 paragraphs, but its impact was seismic. Edward acknowledged his deep personal sorrow over the family's fracture, but affirmed that the integrity of the monarchy must take precedence over personal compassion. He expressed regret that Prince Harry's recent actions had escalated to a level where institutional trust could no longer be sustained. And then he closed with a single sentence that left the room in stunned silence. "I believe full severance is not only justified, it is overdue." Within hours, the letter had been read by Princess Anne and passed silently to King Charles. To the outside world, nothing changed. No official statement, no public disruption. But inside the royal apparatus, the final barrier had fallen. The last advocate for reconciliation had stepped aside, and the last obstacle to what aides were calling the Crownstone activation had been removed. This was no longer about family, it was about institution, and the institution had made its choice. One evening, he confronted Meghan. He asked whether she had known about the 2017 influence contracts, about the staged media leaks, about the undisclosed meetings with image consultants and ghostwriters that predated their engagement, about the documentary proposals drafted before their wedding day. Sources say she didn't deny it. She redirected, she wept. She called it survival, a necessity born from being abandoned by an institution that never wanted her. She asked him if he was still on her side, if he still loved her, if he was going to abandon her the way everyone else had. But for Harry, the question was no longer about loyalty. It was about identity. For the first time in 6 years, he saw himself not as a protector, but as a piece on someone else's chessboard. A man who had burned every bridge, alienated his family, and turned his back on a 1,000-year institution, all while believing he was building a better world. A man who had sacrificed everything for a narrative that was now collapsing under the weight of its own contradictions. And that realization broke him. He didn't announce a separation. He didn't file for divorce. He didn't issue a public statement. But he did something far more devastating in the quiet language of monarchy. He went silent. No more joint statements. No more defensive social media posts. No more appearances standing beside her at carefully staged events. He stopped fighting because for the first time in years, he wasn't sure which side he had ever truly been fighting for. Back in London, Princess Anne received the update in the form of a sealed intelligence memo delivered to her private office. Phase 3. Internal fracture confirmed. Subject: Prince Henry. Recommend proceeding to closure. And with that single notation, the final phase of the operation moved forward. There was no coronet ceremonially removed in front of news cameras. No dramatic scene in the House of Lords. No horse-drawn carriage pulling away from palace gates in exile. The final act of Crownstone unfolded precisely as Princess Anne had designed it: quiet, absolute, irreversible. It began with a routine administrative update buried deep on the official royal family website, an innocuous line tucked into a statement about institutional realignment. As of March 1, 2026, the roles and designations of the Duke and Duchess of Sussex are concluded in accordance with revised constitutional guidelines. No titles listed, no Counselor of State appointments, no references to working members of the royal family, just white space where history used to live. And then came the true blow, the one not released to the press, but quietly delivered to Parliament. A cross-party constitutional review committee, having received Princess Anne's full Crownstone dossier under conditions of strict confidentiality, voted unanimously to support what was formally titled the Royal Succession Clarification Bill. It passed its third reading without public debate, without media coverage, without fanfare. The bill didn't mention names, it didn't need to. It simply established a rule. Harry received the news not from a journalist or a press alert, but from a royal advisor who had once tutored him in constitutional protocol as a teenager. She delivered it in person, along with a handwritten letter from Princess Anne. The note contained no anger, no reprimand, no cruelty. It simply ended with a sentence that left the room silent for nearly an hour. A story without opposition dies, and Meghan's primary adversary had chosen not to argue with her, but to erase her from the conversation entirely. Her final attempt to launch a new media venture, a wellness and empowerment platform backed by Silicon Valley investors, was quietly scrapped after 3 major backers withdrew. Word had spread through discreet channels that carried more weight than any press release. The palace isn't watching anymore. That meant no proximity to power, no reflected legitimacy, no weight. She was no longer a threat. She was alone. Back in London, Princess Anne sat in her private office overlooking the palace gardens. The final operational dossier was sealed, stamped, and marked with a single word: resolved. The operation that many had feared would tear the monarchy apart had done the opposite. It had strengthened the institution by pruning away what threatened to poison it from within. The royal family emerged smaller, yes, colder perhaps, but sharper, streamlined for survival in an era where legacy could no longer be weaponized as leverage. Anne had ensured that access to constitutional duty would never again be treated as a platform for personal profit. That family grief, real and generational, would never again be repackaged as commercial content. That the crown, ancient and imperfect as it was, would endure. And the public, at first confused by the silence, slowly began to understand. They watched Princess Catherine continue her work without distraction or drama. They saw Prince William move forward with quiet dignity, never retaliating, never engaging in the noise. They saw King Charles, older but unbent, recommit himself to legacy without compromise. And they began to speak of Meghan Markle not with outrage or fascination, but with something far more deadly to any public figure: indifference. The ghost of the Duke of Windsor had returned, but this time dressed in tailored California linen instead of military uniform. A prince who gave up everything. A duchess who believed history would remember her as a revolutionary. And an institution that never flinched, never shouted, and never looked back. This was not a feud, it was not a scandal, it was something colder and more final: a deletion. And now, as the final entry is recorded into the constitutional archives, only one truth remains standing in the aftermath. Silence is not the absence of power. Sometimes it is the ultimate proof of it.